This is Pranvera Smith. This is Pranvera Smith's brilliant and very special idea, because with this book club, you can meet the author. And it's a club that is not dependent on talking about just newly published books, but also ones we've been wanting to read for some time, or which we have already read and loved so much we'd like to share. Our authors have included Louis de Bernier, Elif Shafak, Kegi Kuru, and Amanda Craig. And tonight we are so very excited to be chatting to legend in his own time, John Simpson. He's a good fit for this event, of course, a foreign correspondent, author of nonfiction and fiction. And every foreign correspondent's dream to turn their hand successfully to fiction. I know this because I represent a few foreign correspondents myself. We're going to chat about John's latest novel, Our Friends in Beijing, with its rather timely publication this year, coinciding with the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. But I'll also bring in a few references to one of John's previous novels. He has written 4 so far, including Our Friends in Beijing. And this is his novel that I previously read, Moscow Midnight, in preparation for this event tonight. So John needs scant introduction. Everyone I mentioned this event to was sort of sorcerer-eyed about it, even a few of my seasoned foreign correspondents whom I represent. So I'll simply crib from the cover copy. John Simpson has been the BBC World Affairs correspondent for more than half his 52-year career. In his time with the BBC, he has reported on major events all over the world and was made a CBE in the Gulf War Honours List in 1991. He has twice been the Royal Television Society's Journalist of the Year and has won 3 BAFTAs, a News and Current Affairs Award and an Emmy. He lives in Oxford. I've also wanted to add, though, to that very short introduction, pardon me, I've got to put my reading glasses on, so I've got my contacts in. Simpson's reported, this is cribbed from Wikipedia, Simpson's reporting career includes the following episodes. He was exiled by the King of Buganda, Mutesa II, hours before his death in his London flat from alcohol poisoning. The official cause was suicide, but some suspected assassination. He traveled back from Paris to Tehran with the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, a return that heralded the Iranian Revolution as millions lined the streets in the capital. In 1989, which is also crucial to the informing how this book has been written, he spent the early part, he avoided bullets at the Beijing Tiananmen Square massacre. He reported the fall of the Ceausescu regime in Bucharest later that year. He spent the early part of the 1991 Gulf War in Baghdad, etc., etc., etc. So you can see he's always been at the kind of heart of the action. One might think he was a spy. He might be a spy himself, always getting out in the nick of time. So I wanted to say, John, thank you so much. Thank you hugely for joining us. My heart is beating so fast right now, it could generate electricity. Do you remember that line? That's a line from Moscow Midnight. So we have a good crowd here via Zoom, I think about 500 people so far. And though I'm looking forward to having future events in the atmospherics runs of the Frontline Club near Paddington. Of course, there will also be, these will also be Zoom enabled to allow the widest possible audience. As John and I chat, I will aim to feed through questions from the audience, but please bear with me because I'm still kind of mastering this. And sometimes I'm too focused on the author and the discussion as it rolls along. I will do my best, but please do ask questions, and I encourage you to ask, even the most mundane questions, because probably they're not too mundane and probably quite the opposite. They're all the kind of questions that we might want to ask, but are too embarrassed ourselves. So Our Friends in Beijing, like Moscow Midnight, is loosely based on real events, washed liberally with conjecture, and a main character, John Swift, who is vaguely familiar to us readers. Self-effacing, engaging, Jameson's drinking, poetry quoting, and quick with a one-liner, particularly if it makes him seem more attractive to women. Swift has more than a little daring do in his bones, not quite James Bond, but adventurous all the same, and willing at times to bend the rules, or rather disobey orders, ever so slightly if it means he can get to the bones of a good story. The books are fun cliffhangers at every chapter, with John, no age, and his cohorts getting into, and sometimes not always quite out of, scrapes and rather tight and tricky situations, scrambling here and there to avoid local and some international spooks, cops, and assassins. And yes, as I said, they troll through John Simpson's archival experiences, just a bit juiced up. Or are they? That is for us readers to wonder, and if John can't tonight or won't tell us the truth. So John, our friends in Beijing uses the tropes of, friends from Tiananmen in 1989 meeting up again years later, right? And but it's just that one of them is John, and the other one is the Chinese chap who John, the foreign correspondent, met in Tiananmen in 1989, some skinny kid. Now he's risen through the ranks of officialdom. His reputation kind of given a bit of a wash, or he's been kind of rehabilitated in the meantime, and he's now enough of a threat to Xi Jinping to rabble up a bit of trouble and political intrigue. And you happen, to have this connection with him. But this story is loosely based, isn't it, on Neil Heywood and Bo Xilai and Mr. Bo's wife, Gu Keilai, and whom you have called Martin Prinsett, Li Linfang, and Madame Jade. Do you want to tell us about, how you kind of convoluted this story into, their very intriguing story as it was as nonfiction, into another story that is equally, involving and fascinating as a novel?
Yeah, well, I had a lot of conscience wrestling to do when I wrote all this stuff, because I did know, I suppose I could say I do know Bo Xilai, who made a bid for the leadership pretty well. In fact, I mean, this is true. This is not either bullshit or fictionalized reality. Bo Xilai said that I was the author of his career, of his political career. Now, that wasn't actually strictly speaking true, because his dad was a leading figure in the party, somebody that was on the Great March, the Long March with Mao. So, I mean, he didn't really need a leg up from me. But nevertheless, I did go and see him when he was the mayor of Dalian, and I bring this into the book. And I'm a bit embarrassed, or at least I used to be embarrassed, that I took the piss out of him rather heavily for the news report that I was making, documentary really, in that he had really jushed up this city of Dalian, and he'd put loudspeakers everywhere where he could play music. He was the one that, like the DJ, that decided what the music was to be, and he was the one that also decided that colored fountains should be everywhere in the center of Dalian, which is a rather attractive town. And so we filmed him doing these things, and I made him look, I'm afraid, a bit of a twit, because I got him on the console that did both the music and the water, and I got him to kind of change it, and it all happened to be Scottish music. So it was I Love a Lassie and the Bonnie Banks of Loch Lomond and the Bluebells of Scotland. And after a bit, I kind of sort of racked with power. I'd say after just 2 or 3 beats, I'd say, okay, now do another one, and he'd do another one, and the colors were going crazy. Anyway, so and I was deeply embarrassed afterwards. Didn't even write to him because I thought he's going to be so angry. And then a few years later, not very many years later, I was in Beijing for another particular reason, and I bumped into him. I actually bumped into him. He was. It was at a press conference. It was that he and others were giving, and I sort of anyway, I didn't know where to look. And he came over to me and said, I owe you a great debt. And I thought he was going to say, and that's the debt. But in fact, he told me that the Chinese leadership had been so impressed by his mastery of the Western media that he was promoted immediately. And he really did become very close to being the new boss of China. We could have Bo Xilai now, in which case I wouldn't be writing novels about him. But instead, he overplayed his hand, and I've kind of done written a version of how this happened. And he's now serving a life sentence at His Majesty's pleasure.
I mean, I wanted to talk about the way his rehabilitation. You said in this book that with Tiananmen remaining pretty much unmentionable, thus, don't ask, don't tell. It's a bit like going to Germany and asking someone's grandfather or uncle, what did they do during the war, right? It's the same thing with Tiananmen, and that allowed Bo Xilai, or your character Lin, to kind of go dark for a while and then emerge rehabilitated, as many people have done, right? Or
well, I mean, that was based on, in fact, not on Bo Xilai. I never asked him what he did at the time of Tiananmen, though he made it clear he really disapproved of the massacre and so on. But this is based on another friend of mine who also is a politician, but a far, far lower local politician. But he was one of the students. In fact, I interviewed him during the demonstrations that led up to the massacre, and so I kind of merged the two. I don't know whether Bo Xilai was in the square. He was the right age. And I personally, I suspect that Xi Jinping might well have been in the square as well. I mean, most of certainly the younger people who were kind of sons and daughters of party stalwarts, they were definitely there. But again, I don't think anybody probably has ever asked Xi Jinping, where were you in the last few days of May 1989.
I mean, I learned a lot about Tiananmen from a woman I used to work with in Hong Kong. She was a journalist. She'd worked for the Washington Times, but had lived in China for many years and was there at the time they were trying to get into China from the border with a group of Boy Scouts. And she told me how it happened as it unfolded. And she said that from what she told me, and she's fluent in Mandarin, that the students were, absolutely, as we know, they were well-meaning, but actually they were manipulated, beyond their understanding, and by what was at the time pretty much fake news. It was a kind of rumor mill of dissent and culminating in the slaughter. And it was a case of, innocence being. I was thinking about, William of Orange, given your references to Ireland in your books, that where the people were not really understanding the wider and more far-reaching implications of their actions, right, and how they were being used as pawns, basically, the students.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely true, and you had the two factions, Zhao Ziyang's faction trying to overthrow the regime of Deng Xiaoping, or at least overthrow him and take over, and it didn't work, and they used the fact that the country was absolutely paralyzed by the demonstrations to try to get rid of Deng. And Deng, I mean, you may not like him, and you certainly probably won't like what he did, but you have to admire his extraordinary guts in sticking to it, and not just going, I forget how old he was at the time, about my age now, I think, actually, but not just taking a well-deserved retirement, but fighting to stay there.
Mm-hmm. So there's a line that some of the lines in here really ring. They sound so true to me. There's a line, page 1991, Lin's father soiling himself when the Red Guards showed up at the door. And Lynn said, I was too young. It was my brother who told me. And where did this anecdote come from?
Again, a friend of mine, very, the thing is, I spent a lot of time in China at that stage, months and months, talking to everybody. But the time difference meant that the usual constraints on television correspondence didn't really apply, because the daytime was British nighttime. So I was able just to do what every journalist ought to do anyway, and just wander around and talk to it. I must have talked to, well, certainly hundreds, perhaps even in the thousands of people, finding out their stories, listening to them. And some of this got, a little bit of it got distilled into the book.
Mm-hmm. So do you speak Chinese?
I do a bit. I did a bit. Then I'm afraid it's faltered. I just had a wonderful translator who stuck with me the whole time, right through until through the massacre and afterwards. I've never seen him again, actually, and I'm sure he kind of buried his head as deep as it'd go after the massacre. But he was absolutely magnificent. English was flawless, and he was a student himself. So he a slightly older student, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's really clear how, to me, because I know China, and I lived in Hong Kong for 4 years and traveled in China and to Beijing and many times. It's clear that I mean, obviously, as people would expect, you really understand the nuances of China, but you also understand too well the often vague disinterest of the talking heads, in London, about the hugely important, movement of events in, quote, foreign worlds outside our own. And you write on page 55 about pitching a piece to your editor in London, about China, about your friend made good, saying, my editor loved it. When you're on the slide yourself, like Britain is, it's always comforting to feel superior to the people who are starting to replace you. I think, I mean, this is one of the things which really opened my eyes when I first went out to Hong Kong in 2011. And it was like the height of the recession in this country. And as soon as I got into Hong Kong, what recession? The bars were full, it was full of bling. And, that was like all across Asia. And I thought, oh, this is, the world has turned. And I wanted people back in the UK and in the West to understand what I was seeing before my eyes. But it's been an uphill battle trying to convince them of it until more recently. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I fully agree. And I mean, I love China, and until moderately recently, so about 2010 or something, you could still imagine that China would liberalize itself politically, and also in terms of its own human rights. I mean, I remember, I think it was 2010, I went to see quite a well-known dissident who was under house arrest, and he had I think I brought this in the book, actually. He had a guard outside his door, and we had to creep underneath to get in and see the old boy and interview him. And he was a highly intelligent man who had been a senior politician, member of the Central Committee, until he went a little bit too far for the powers that were at that stage. He said to me, within 5 years, I shall be an elected member of the Chinese parliament. And so somebody, as aware and as understanding as that, thought that was the future for China. And instead, of course, Xi Jinping came in and put the brakes on all of that. And I mean, we've seen the consequences ever since. And, China now is starting both to be regarded by us, and to some extent regards itself as being in opposition to the West, perhaps not an enemy, but a powerful competitor with the West. And I'm really depressed about that, because I did think that we could have a kind of companionship with China, which would lead the world through to a kind of easier, better time.
Not necessarily with Xi Jinping. He's got too much to prove, not only for himself, but for his father and grandfather, right? So there's this whole history of him, things to prove. I have a question here from the audience that I'll just ask outright. Ewan Grant, London, says, fictional books about shady places have been a big help to me, including those of several of your colleagues. Does writing fiction mean you are safe or safer from the libel lawyers? Good question.
It is a good question. Yes, I mean, I suppose that's true, really. In my case, though, I've now emerged, I'm glad to say, but I've been through quite a torrid time with the BBC, kind of clinging on by my fingernails, having a boss who was, really, really enthusiastic about the notion of getting rid of me. Probably quite rightly. I mean, but when it's you don't want to be made to walk the plank. And so I, of course, you couldn't resist putting some of this stuff in. And so it was a kind of, wasn't just that I wanted to get a view of China over, actually. That is certainly, definitely true. But also, let's face it, I wanted an element of getting my own back on somebody who I felt had been treating me quite unfairly.
I mean, I'll just jump in there as a former editor myself and as an agent. You still can't avoid the libel laws. You have to make sure that everything that you write is true, and it's in the public domain, or can be provable just by changing somebody's name or their hair color. It doesn't mean you escape libel just because it's fiction. A lot of people might believe that, but you can't. It has to be true or true enough, and you have to make
sure. I should have come to you when I wrote it and got you to check it out.
Well, I mean, they will have the lawyers look it over, and I used to ask the lawyers who did the legal read. So, we used to ask them for like a risk assessment, on a scale of 1 to 10, are we liable to get, sued? And some of the lawyers, were very, would go on. And I said, no, I just need a scale, 1, 2, 3. I don't need all the legalese explanation. So yeah, I've got, okay. Jeremy Grant, he says Britain can't seem to decide how it deals with China. We had the golden age, quote unquote, under Cameron / Osborne. Now we have a position of circumspect engagement. Is Britain condemned by its past, Hong Kong, etc., never to land on a workable approach to China? And how will China exploit that if true?
Well, I think it's actually lies in China's hands and not in Britain's. I mean, I'm absolutely certain that if it were possible for the British government to have the best possible relationship with China, it would want that. And I mean, I'm sure I dare say they believe in the rights of people in Hong Kong and so forth, but it doesn't always sound as though they, those are in the forefront when they're talking about China. It's an unfortunate business that we've hit this particular time. I mean, it would have been so much better for Britain if the tradition of the two-term presidencies and so on, which I think gave China such strength and such prosperity, had continued through after Xi Jinping. But as you recall, I mean, if he he's now made it so that if he wants to be president for life, he can be, and that's a difficult thing for the British. I think the British are always kind of going to be wrong-footed by China, just as the Americans are. And it isn't actually that in Britain's gift or America's gift to have the kind of relationship that I'm sure it would actually prefer to have with China.
Mm-hmm. So you set the scene. So I want to get back to the book, though, rather than these kind of great questions about China, but we'll weave them in, but more to the book. So we have, you set the scene so well, both in Moscow midnight and in our friends in Beijing. Big plug for the author here again. You describe the sounds and the sights and the tastes, not only in the foreign countries that you're in, but also in London. What I wouldn't do right now after reading Our Friends in Beijing, I was reading, my mouth was watering the thought of sitting at a round table, eating dim sum, washed down with endless cups of tea and congee. I love congee with peanuts particularly. And you write about the foods and the good parts and the bad parts, and I love how you set the scenes in your novels. I wanted to ask you, what does this lead me? Yeah, and I wanted to ask you here as well about, oh God, I just lost my place. So you also weave in, Ireland as well to this, because you lived in Ireland. So your character, John, no age, harkens back to his time in Ireland. He mentions Dalkey and Fitzpatrick Bar, and you're great about mentioning places that you've been to, so that people, there is a sort of sense of reality to it, not just it makes people want to visit these places as well, I think. And you must, like you mentioned, the Frontline Club as well. I mean, do you get free drinks wherever you go now because you mentioned these? Is it, is there an ulterior motive?
Well, I mean, I'm never without an ulterior motive of some kind, but I tell you what it is. I mean, I'm a fanatic. I'm a sort of literary fanatic. I studied English. I'm more at home, really, in books than I am in the world. And the books that I love the most are the books where you can follow the character from place to place. I mean, that's the wonder of Ulysses, of James Joyce's Ulysses. You can walk down the streets where James Joyce presumably walked, and where certainly his characters walked. And I mean, I'm not in any sense suggesting that I belong on a plane anywhere near James Joyce, but I love that in literature. I love the idea of a sense of place and the kind of things that you go to. I was in a New Broadcasting House, the BBC's headquarters today, and weirdly I stumbled across a corridor that I hadn't yet been to, and the two photographs of the original of Room 101 in 1984, because the Orwell was working in the old building at that stage, and the 101 existed as a room, and it was what he based it on. And somebody had the wit, they knocked it down, alas, but somebody had the wit to get it fully photographed and documented. And that kind of actuality is what I love to read, and so I try to stick it in as much as I can when I write things.
Is Malone's in Off St. Martin's Lane, is that Beaujolais?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
no, it's not. It's
Malone's. I just couldn't find it. I don't know Malone's. And also, speaking of,
oh gosh, it'll come back to me. Sheiky's.
Okay. I love Sheiky's as well. Oh my God, having his lockdown is going.
Where they took me in, and my kid. One, I think I put that in the book actually. I came in a rainstorm, and my kid and I, we must have looked like, you know, something out of Dickens, and they treated us as though, you know, we were they'd been waiting all day to have
Yeah.
us in there, that we gave something to the place rather than the place giving something to us. So, you know, our wet footsteps everywhere, and we round sort of arse marks of wet on the seats, and
Yeah.
they so I thought they deserve a plug, but I called it Sheikies, I think, originally, and then I just thought, no, you better, if you're going to do these things, you better stick to fiction rather than sort of half fiction.
Mm. And you mentioned, I'm sort of trying to spot who's who in Moscow Midnight. So I think you've mentioned Charles Glass as well. Was he one of the characters?
Mm.
Yeah. And speaking of Charles, one of my authors, Victor Mallet, said when I told him that I was interviewing you, he said, "Oh, he liberated Kabul." Victor said. um, Charles Glass, and you mentioned Jerry Hall, the blonde, and you mentioned, I love your caricature of Murdoch. It's just, you know, brilliant. And McCartney, the character in that you mentioned in, or the historical figure in our friends in Beijing. Do you really have a relative like him who's half Chinese?
No, I don't. No, I made that up. But McCartney was half Chinese, and I've always loved his work and his stuff. So no, I just, that was an outright steal, I'm afraid.
Okay. Look, I've got some questions here. What was the best-selling book about China in the last 50 years? What was it? And was it fiction or non-fiction? What sells best about China? China-related fiction or China-related non-fiction? That was Peter Humphrey.
Well, I suppose Mao's Little Red Book was probably. I mean, wouldn't you like to be the agent for Mao when he wrote that?
Yeah, and then there's also Yung Chang's book has sold phenomenally well, hasn't it? Wild Swans. And what about Pearl Buck, I suppose?
Yeah, I just don't want to plug anybody else's book tonight.
So Olive Connor and Iskillen. Does a large and disparate country not have to be wary of those who, quote, go too far, and at some points would argue that the steel fist has to be withdrawn from the silken glove?
I'm sorry, I'm so dopey. I don't understand what the reference is.
Does a large and disparate country, not like, I guess, China, have to be wary of those who go too far? And at some points, it is arguable that it is better that the steel fist has to be withdrawn from the silken glove.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm all in favor of silken gloves. I've seen too many iron fists being used in my lifetime to be hugely enthusiastic about them. You know, usually what happens, I'm not necessarily talking about China here, although of course the Tiananmen experience was a very good example of it. But what happens is that people's own sense of their, I mean, politicians' own sense of their position and the needs of their party, their group, their backers, whatever it may be, feel that that's more important than the lives sometimes of ordinary people. And that's certainly what happened with Deng Xiaoping. I mean, I would have thought that, you know, 99.99% of politicians, when they saw millions of people out in the streets, literally millions, or right across China, all demanding that Deng Xiaoping should leave power, you might think that that was quite a good nudge for him to do precisely that. Instead, he managed, after weeks of trying, to find a couple of generals who were prepared to lead their men into the square and shoot everybody down. Actually, I think he's quite important to say. They didn't necessarily shoot people down inside the square. It was in the avenues leading up to it. You may think that sounds preposterous to even make the distinction, but the Chinese government gets really angry and frenzied if you talk about killing people in the square. And there are people who are dopey enough to believe it when the Chinese government says nobody died in the square. Actually, I'm not sure whether that's true, but I can promise you that they died in the avenues leading up to the square. And I myself saw no fewer than 40 people shot, mostly shot dead. I think it was 41.
I mean, you say, were you watching it from a balcony, as you mentioned in the book? You say,
yeah, in the end I was. I mean, we left the square itself when it looked pretty much as though we weren't going to survive the experience, and went back to a balcony in the Beijing hotel, which now is, I think, a Four Seasons hotel.
You say in the book, in Our Friends in Beijing, you said, don't imagine we were safe even there on the balcony looking over Tiananmen on June 4. The soldiers squirted off burst after burst at us as if they saw movement. And on the next balcony to ours, a jolly Korean news photographer who was always winking and smiling took a round in the chest and died. Did that really happen?
Yeah, well, that happened just in the balcony, just beside us. And I mean, we often had, during the night, often had to lie down because they were just shooting up at the building randomly. I don't know whether they knew that there were journalists there, but that position was the one from which we got all the famous pictures, you know, right through from the fall of the goddess of democracy, the plaster figure, right through to the tank man with his bags of shopping standing in front of the tank. We did it all from that one balcony. I didn't feel very good that we were on the balcony. I felt we should have stayed in the square. I don't want to go over it. And one of the people that I was with, one of my cameramen, is now dead, so I don't want to go into the argument that we had and everything. But I felt bad for some time, some years actually afterwards, for having given up the square and gone to the relative safety of the balcony. I mean, it wasn't safe, but it was safer than being down on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the same subject, but speaking of the Beijing hotel becoming the Four Seasons, I mean, you have this really excellent sort of short chapter 30, just one page, about, you know, China now and how it's, you know, become so rich, and the change in the years since you've been there. And I mean, I one of my authors, a North Korean defector, I took her back to China. I was with her when she went back to Beijing after, you know, 14 years of not having been in the country. And I used to see it change every year that I would go back. You know, I'd search for my hotel, and one of the hotels I used to stay in, it would be gone, you know, and then there would be a new hotel in its place the next year. And then they've got an intercontinental there now. And my author Hyunso, she had kind of hidden out in plain sight in China and hadn't been back for many years, as I said, 14. And I was taking her around, and when we came out of her hotel, she was stunned. She didn't speak. She just looked around. And I said, "What's wrong, Hyunso? What's wrong?" And she said, "People are rich."
Yes. Well, good. You know,
Yeah,
I love it. I mean, I absolutely revel in the increased wealth. I'm just I'm not always sure that I like the uses that it's been put to in other countries and so on.
So one of the members of the audience has asked a rather unusual observation about an artistic lineup behind you in your room.
Oh, oh dear.
There are some recognizable characters from the Chinese and Soviet leaderships, but who is the chap above them? This is an
Oh,
anonymous.
yeah, no, I'm so sorry. The thing is, I've got to explain this. I've got a 15-year-old son
Mm-hmm.
who is football mad,
Mm-hmm.
and he's obsessed with the Belgian football team at the moment, and they're playing Denmark. So I've been relegated to the guest bedroom where we put all the junk, and of course, I'm rather inclined to kind of want to freak out
Mm-hmm.
guests who come to stay. So there's Mao and Lin Biao and a couple of characters from the revolution, the cultural revolution there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're absolutely right. I'm terribly impressed. There's Lenin on the printer, but there is actually a journalist ancestor of mine called, I'm afraid, Solomon Proctor Slee. Great name to
Great
have,
name, isn't it?
except that, of course, in those days they didn't have bylines, so poor old Solomon didn't ever see his name in print. But we just bunged him there because I remember my first wife. I've got a portrait of another ancestress of mine, really ferocious old dragon, and my first wife wouldn't sleep in the room with this enormous old girl glaring down. I did see her point, but sadly the marriage broke up, but the old girl is still hanging in the hall outside.
So I think that's also in one of your novels, one of the two that I've read, maybe Moscow Midnight. Which country, Jeremy Grant, which country did you always want to return to, and why? Only one allowed, he says.
Oh, okay, only one. Iran. I spent almost the entire revolution. The Iranian revolution lasted almost a year, and I spent almost that whole time there before February and the fall of the Shah. Actually, the Shah left in January, and Ayatollah Khomeini, with whom I flew back from Paris, landed in I think the same day or the next day or something, very soon afterwards anyway. And I've been back and back, written 2 books about Iran. And then in 2009, the BBC set up its Persian language service for television, which is incredibly popular in Persian-speaking countries, and indeed very, very popular in Iran. Probably the most popular broadcasting organization in Iran, but the Ayatollahs have stamped down very, very hard on it, brutally, towards the families, often of people who work for the BBC Persian service. And I think I'm right in saying that only about 2 or 3 BBC people have been given visas since 2009. And they've always been, I think, almost always trying to desperately to convince the government in Tehran to give the BBC more visas. So you can see that hasn't had much effect. But that's where I'd go. It's one of my favorite countries. I'm not sure it's not my favorite country to go to, because it's both wonderful, but lovely, charming, delightful people, and it's difficult. And that combination of delightful people, beauty, and difficulty is something which is hard for, I think, for most foreign correspondents to resist, really.
A little bit like Alyssa, your production assistant in Our Friends in Beijing, right? A little bit difficult, a challenge.
Yes, she exists.
Mm.
I'm hoping she won't see me.
Look, I love your one-liners, John. You say about someone, he had teeth as irregular as a Sichuan farm fence. He took a swig. He took a swig of his Qingtao like a full stop. I love that line. They scattered before me like hares in a meadow. Um, their idea of a good problem was one that went away. I love that one too. And
That
here's
must be about the BBC.
yeah,
That must be about the BBC.
yeah, and here's one. In the court of present day society, I'd be found guilty of old think and sentenced to be ostracized by the neck until dead. Um,
That's a
and then
bit close to the bone, actually, isn't it?
and
Really.
here's another one. What makes a dimly lit restaurant with steamed up windows feel so enticing, like being back in the womb for a bit? So I've got more questions here. Anonymous attendee. Are there places you'd never want your children to go if they were to follow in your footsteps?
Oh, I mean, I don't think I've got two daughters
Mm,
by my first marriage,
mm,
who probably rightly saw what effect being a foreign correspondent can have on family life, and they've been absolutely determined not to have anything to do with it. One's a headmistress, and the other one um, actually she has been doing filmmaker now. She's making films, but not as a reporter.
mm,
I'd love it, of course, if my son, who the 15-year-old, were to go into journalism, but I don't think he's very interested in that either. But if he did,
mm,
I would want them to go everywhere. There's nowhere I would say don't go there. I mean I wish I'd been everywhere, and the places that I haven't been are often the places I most want to go to.
mm. Well, speaking of this, Edson Eworo says, "Are you? Please forgive me for massacring people's names. Are you planning to on going to Nigeria to write a story, especially with what's happening now in the country with Boko Haram and the malicious acts of the Fulani herdsmen?"
Well, I haven't actually been to Nigeria for some time, but I have done some reporting on Boko Haram, and I went up to the area where they were active at the time in the northeast. I love Nigeria. I mean, one of the problems that I find is actually I'm pretty much like most places, except I'm not very enthusiastic about Dubai, but the most of the rest of the world I love. But I like places that aren't just easy, that don't just open up and everything is simple and operating is a breeze. I don't like that. I like places where things are a bit difficult, and frankly, Nigeria is quite a difficult place to operate. Sometimes can be,
Mhm.
but it's the people are what you obviously are there to see and to report on, and a more charming, exciting, kind of friendly place you couldn't actually find. So I'd love to go back. I mean, the trouble is it's this bloody COVID stuff that stopped everything, and unfortunately the BBC noticed at some stage that I was incredibly old, and and they started, actually one of my bosses said it, that just think what the Daily Mail would say if we sent you somewhere and you died of COVID.
Ah,
Well, I mean, they never
everybody
seemed to
dies
mind if I
of COVID.
died of something else, but I suppose they've got a point. Anyway, I mean, I've travelled nowhere, but there are signs that things are coming back, and I'm hoping to do a bit of quite interesting travel really quite soon. So maybe, I mean, the story of my life really has been that you should always try to survive your opponents, and in this case, I'm hoping to survive COVID as well.
Mm. I wanted to talk a little bit about. Well, first I wanted to say you do mention the Uyghurs in here. briefly.
Mhm.
I think you gave them a wide berth. I was wondering if you were doing that because you were hoping for translation rights sales into Chinese. I guess that line could be struck quite easily. But on that was page 174. But in Moscow Midnight, you say, I have always, or the John says, I have always believed devoutly, perhaps it's the only thing I do believe devoutly, that we have a duty to put difficult things into the public domain and allow people to make up their minds about them. I suppose that was why I became a journalist. And John, I spent a few months last year in America, where I'm from, with my family, and I was astonished, really astonished and shocked by how opinionated news has become there. It was difficult to find simple, straightforward, factual coverage to allow me to make up my own mind. I just want the facts, and the FT I could only access online. You could in Florida, it's very hard to find the FT. And why do you think this country is following suit? And is there is there anything that we can do to stop progress of this kind of opinionated journalism?
Well, can I just, I just want to, I don't want to give the impression that I shuffled away from the Uyghur story. In fact, I mean, in real life, as in the novel, I've traveled up to Xinjiang. I've done quite a lot of reporting there, got arrested loads of times. And I brought all that into the book. I had to rather wrench it in because it didn't flow naturally from the basic story of a political crisis in China. But I nevertheless wouldn't want to give the impression that I'd backed away from it. And in fact, I've done quite a lot of writing and reporting about the Uyghurs and what's happened to them. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a real danger. What was the rule called, the fairness and balance and fairness rule or something? I should know this. I should have it absolutely in the forefront of my mind. Used to apply to broadcasters in the US. And I think about 1986, Ronald Reagan decided to abolish that, or to allow that rule to be abolished. And that, of course, within a couple of years or so, gave birth to Fox News, and Fox News gave birth to even more extreme versions. Until now, you're quite right. I mean, it is difficult to find balanced reporting. PBS does some, but it's got absolutely no money. CNN, I'm a great supporter and fan of CNN, and they've tried very hard, but they were so much under attack by President Trump and all his supporters in the media that they soon started to sort of fall into the category of enemy of Trump, which I think was a sad and a mistake. And I mean, I think you'll find that there's a lot of people in Britain now on both sides of the political fence who would love it if journalism, television and radio journalism, took sides. And I just think, well, it won't happen to me and over my dead body. But then, since I'm 76, that may not be too long in advance. But I think it's absolutely terrible to see the way that this has happened in the US, and I'm just praying that we don't have a media here that takes sides. I mean, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what GB News, how it finally shakes down, because I mean, it isn't allowed to take a political stance on anything. And so, we'll see what Ofcom rules about it.
Okay. Look, John, you've written 12 works of non-fiction, and this is your fourth work of fiction. I mean, when do you find the time to write, and which do you prefer writing? Which do you find easier, more fulfilling? Which book do you think has been your most successful book personally, not in terms of reviews or sales? Which book has given you the most fulfillment?
I wrote a book about my family and my own childhood, and I kind of blended it in with the history of the Britain that I grew up in the late 40s and early 50s. That gave me a huge amount of pleasure. It enraged, I'm sad to say, my half sister, who didn't speak to me for years and years afterwards, and now sadly dead. So that, that's what happens in families sometimes. But I felt really pleased with that. But otherwise, I mean, fiction, of course, is enormously enjoyable, because you can get revenge on people you don't like. I was reading the other day some stuff about George Orwell, whose books I've always delighted in, and he grew up. Well, didn't grow up, but he spent an awful lot of his young manhood in the town of Southwold in Suffolk, which is just close to where I grew up. And all the characters in 1984 and in Animal Farm are people that he kind of wanted revenge on in Southwold, a sort of, totally innocent, dopey backwater. They found themselves in some of the best books in the English language. So it's huge fun to do that.
And does it, I just wanted to mention the book that you so loved writing or felt fulfilled from writing was Days from a Different World, a memoir of childhood, right? That's the title.
That's right.
Days
That's right.
from a World, a memoir of childhood. And when do you write? When, in the morning, afternoon? Which do you find, is it easier to write nonfiction for you as a journalist, or is it easier to write the novels, or just different?
No, the novels are easier, but not only because, I don't have to check every fact and go through absolutely everything and, ring people up and go to the library. I mean, I can just kind of make it up as I go along. So that's a lot easier. I write, the best time I find is the early morning before the household gets up. So I crawl out of bed at 5 o'clock and sit down and start bashing away. And sometimes it flows, sometimes it doesn't flow. But it's always better, I feel, than in the rest of the time. So by sort of 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, I've done a good day's writing, and then I can do the rest of the jobs, whatever they may be, and take the dog for a walk.
So what did your agent say, Julian, when you said, "Oh, I want to write novels"? Because as an agent, and I have my wonderful foreign correspondents, and a lot of them say they want to write novels, and I it's as I said, it's every foreign correspondent's dream come true to be a successful novelist. What did your agent say when you pitched this to him, these ideas, or the first novel idea?
I kind of got an idea that it was his suggestion, actually.
Right, okay.
The thing is, when I was really quite young, relatively, in 1980, I think, and 1982, somewhere around there, I wrote a couple of novels, one of which was greeted, had mixed reviews. I mean, some of them were really good, actually. Really good, and I thought I'd got a future there. But the Times Literary Supplement, I remember, in its review, gave the feeling that kind of civilization itself had just been slightly kind of set back by my novel. In those days, you see, I mean, I'm not suggesting, I'm sure that the review was perfectly correct and adequate, but when I started writing fiction, there was a great sense that television people can't write. They're just pretty faces. They're gobs on a stick. They just read off autocue. They're told what to say, and therefore, how could they write fiction apart from anything else? How could they? They might possibly write about their experiences, although it's bound to be crap, but they couldn't possibly write fiction. So I rather gave it up actually for a while, and then I think Julian Alexander, my agent, said, you know, why don't you try it again? And so we did. There was a publisher who was very keen at John Murray. Moved on afterwards, but he was very keen, and that was why. I don't know that I'm going to carry on doing it, especially if I'm not, you know, don't have sort of bugs to work out of the system so much.
And now that TV, especially during the pandemic, has become, you know, so revitalized in terms of, you know, these television series, TV series, are your books going to be on TV or made into movies or films, as they say here? And, you know, and who would play you? Would it be Attenborough?
Well, Attenborough is a bit. Actually, I know I look like
It's
David
from
Attenborough.
your book.
I used not to. Oh yeah, I wrote it in the book, didn't
That's
I?
what you
Well,
wrote in the book. I'm trying to make a joke.
Yeah, I forgot, of course. Yes, yeah. I mean, I don't know who Attenborough is. 99 or 105.
I know. Yeah, I know. That's a
even older than me. But I know I look like him. In fact, sometimes I see a photograph of him in the paper and I think, Jesus Christ, what have I done? Why are they showing a photograph of me? So I know it's true. But even so, when people say to me, has anybody ever told you you look like, I always say, no, what? You know, who? But no, I don't, who would play the part? I mean, they don't have actors my age now, do they?
Well, I mean,
they do. Harrison Ford is
yeah.
a year old.
Yeah, and you know, it doesn't really matter, does it? Because I think I remember Ian Rankin was a bit cheesed off by they chose John, what's his name, who was in Four Weddings and a Funeral. They chose him to be Rebus, and he didn't really like it as a character. It wasn't the kind of person he had in mind. So I think it doesn't really matter. But do you have any film and TV? Are there anything? Are these in the works as films or TV?
Not that I know. I mean, maybe, I don't know. Who knows? Yeah. I might be surprised, but no plan at the future. I suppose by the second, it's usually if you watch these things as I do rather urgently. It's usually, I'm afraid, about volume 4 or 5 that people start to think there's a series in this as opposed to just a couple.
Here's a question. Are there any ideas for a new book or a TV or radio program?
What a very perceptive question. Yeah, I mean, a new book, yes, I've got a factual book, which I'm just about, I hope to sign an agreement on. The program idea, I mean, all I can say at the moment is sort of kind of watch this space, because there are some plans afoot.
Okay. Until the ink is dry, right?
Yes.
So look, I don't want to go on too long. We've been chatting for about an hour, and you know these programs are about an hour long, and I don't want to keep you for much longer. We've been so delighted to chat with you. It's such an honor, and I was so excited about it, and I hope to meet you in person.
I can't imagine anybody else is still watching, but if they are, thank you, thank you for putting up with me.
I can't wait to see you in the Frontline Club. Maybe Charles Glass will be there as well. And
yeah.
But no, it was such a lovely chat, and you've been so gracious and kind and forgiving of me, the total amateur, interviewing you. So I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. And I'm going to recommend, I was recommending this book to everybody when I was reading it. So please, I'm pitching this to our friends in Beijing, and this one as well beforehand, published by John Murray and Penguin Random House. Excellent reads. Everybody should have a copy. Buy it now. Okay.
Thank you. My agent will love you for it.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.